I wasn't supposed to be there. That morning, I'd made coffee, looked out at my rose bushes, and told myself, don't go. Funerals are for widows and wives. Not for the ex who faded quietly out of frame over 2 decades ago. And yet, I went. I wore navy, not black. Quiet, not mourning. Officially, I went to pay respects. But the truth? I went to look a ghost in the eye and say, you don't get to haunt me anymore. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few polite nods. Maybe to blend into the pews like wallpaper. But then she saw me, Dana. Polished. Blonde. Still the star of every room, even at her husband's funeral. Her smile was tight and cold. And when our eyes met, she laughed. A short, sharp sound, just loud enough for me to hear. No one else. Just me. It wasn't grief. It wasn't nerves. It was amusement. At me. I didn't flinch. But I felt it, a stillness inside me. Like the moment before a storm begins. Quiet. Precise. I sat. I folded my hands. And then the lawyer stood up, holding something in his hand, thick, wax-sealed. Dana's laugh stopped. I hadn't seen Jack in person for almost 2 decades. Over the years, I occasionally caught glimpses of him in a magazine or on television, always sharp-looking, well-groomed, with Dana by his side. It used to hurt, in those early years. Later, it just settled into something duller. Not forgiveness, but distance. A kind of emotional scar tissue, you remember how it happened, but you stop expecting it to reopen. I arrived at the church a few minutes before the service began and slipped into a pew near the back. I didn't expect to see anyone I knew, and I didn't. The people around me were mostly polished and connected, country club friends, business partners, people in tasteful black coats murmuring polite things about legacies. I didn't belong in that world anymore, if I ever did. Standing at his funeral, I wasn't sure where I fit. I wasn't a widow. I wasn't part of the life he built after me. No one handed me a tissue or asked how I was holding up. I didn't expect them to. That kind of space is reserved for the woman who stayed, not the one he left. Dana looked flawless, as always. Her dress was expensive but subtle, her hair perfectly set, her expression composed. She stood near the front of the chapel like someone fulfilling a public role rather than grieving a husband. I watched her carefully. She wasn't crying. Maybe she had already done her crying in private. Or maybe she didn't feel the need. The service was formal. Structured. A slideshow played across a large screen, highlighting Jack's career milestones, ribbon cuttings, interviews, foundation galas, awards. There were pictures of him and Dana together in beautiful places, on a boat in Capri, at a fundraiser in D.C., at some press event shaking hands with a governor. All very polished. Very public. What I noticed most was the absence of anything real. There were no candid moments, no quiet memories. No photos from his early years, our years. Not a single picture of our son. It wasn't just that Joshua was left out, it was as though Jack's life hadn't started until Dana entered it. I wasn't surprised, but I felt something shift in me. Something tired. Something old and sore. When we met, Jack wasn't wealthy or important. He was a lecturer at a regional college, teaching economics and public policy. I was working at the university library. We met when I helped him locate a first edition he needed for research. It was simple. We liked each other. We fell in love. We got married because we both wanted a quiet, steady life. I never asked for luxury. I wanted a home, a family, a life I could count on. And for a while, that's what we had. We bought a modest house with a little backyard where I planted tulips every spring. We watched old films on Sunday nights. We took long drives without a destination. And then Joshua was born. He was everything to me. I think, deep down, Jack loved him too, even if he never knew how to show it. But things changed. Slowly at first. Jack's job opportunities grew. He started speaking at national events. Then came media attention. He was flattered by it. Encouraged by it. Then swept up in it. I watched the shift happen, how he became more careful with his image, more rehearsed in his words. He stopped singing in the car. He stopped making late-night pancakes just because. He stopped looking at me with softness. I didn't accuse him. I didn't chase him. And when the end came, I didn't fight it. He didn't come home from a conference one week. A letter arrived instead, written by his attorney. He said he needed a different life. That it wasn't anyone's fault. That he hoped I'd understand. There was no scandal, no custody battle. Just quiet separation. He paid what he owed, on time, through his attorney. He didn't call Joshua. He didn't visit. And I didn't force the issue. Instead, I gave my son a version of the truth he could live with, that his father had died in an accident. It was a lie, but it felt cleaner than the truth. I sometimes wondered if Jack ever thought about the way we disappeared from his story. If he noticed the empty place where his child should have been. But if he did, he never reached out. So when I sat at that funeral, watching the photo montage roll by, I expected nothing. I wasn't angry anymore. Just resigned. Then Mr. Goldberg stepped forward. I recognized him immediately. He was Jack's attorney back when we divorced, professional, polite, always carefully worded. He looked older now, but still composed. He cleared his throat and began to speak. There is a final matter to address, per Mr. Reed's instructions, he said, holding a leather folder. Dana looked calm at first, then vaguely puzzled. I doubt she expected anything unusual. From the way she glanced at her watch, she was probably just waiting for this last formality to finish. Mr. Goldberg opened the folder and pulled out a sealed envelope. I recognized the red wax seal, Jack's initials, pressed into the center. I'd seen it before, years ago. He used it on personal letters, back when we still wrote to each other during his travel. This is addressed to Mrs. Garland, Mr. Goldberg said, and for a moment the entire room went still. It had been years since anyone used that name, Garland. My married name. I don't even think Joshua remembered it. I sat up straighter. He walked across the chapel and handed me the envelope. It was heavy. I took it in both hands, unsure what to expect. Dana's face turned sharply toward me. She was no longer casual. Her posture tightened. I opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a letter, handwritten, and behind it, several pages of legal documents. I read the letter first. It wasn't long. Jack's tone was matter-of-fact. He apologized for the silence, said he had made mistakes, and that he hoped this final act would make some part of it right. That was it. No poetic lines. No explanations. Just a quiet acknowledgement that he had done harm, and he wanted to leave something better behind. Then I read the will. Jack had left everything to Joshua. Not a trust fund. Not a fraction. Every account, every property, every share of every company, all of it. Dana and her children were disinherited entirely. The wording was blunt and legally airtight. There were no loopholes. No questions. I looked up, confused at first, and met Mr. Goldberg's eyes. He gave a single nod. Dana stood and crossed the aisle, holding out her hand. I handed her the will. There was nothing to hide. I watched her read it, line by line. At first, she looked uncertain, then panicked. I could see her struggling to keep her face still. Her hands began to tremble. She sat back down heavily, the documents still in her lap. Her face was pale. No one said anything. The air in the room had changed. For the first time in 20 years, I didn't feel like a forgotten part of Jack's story. He had remembered. He had made a choice. And he had done it in front of everyone. After the service ended, people filed out quietly. There was no music. No reception line. No gathering of mourners sharing stories over bad coffee and stale cookies. It felt less like a funeral and more like the end of a performance no one quite understood. I waited until most had left before rising. I didn't want attention. I didn't want confrontation. I just wanted to leave. Dana was standing near the front pew, still holding the will in her hands. Her jaw was set, her expression tight. She didn't look at me until I passed her by. Then she spoke, low and sharp. "This isn't over." I stopped. Turned slightly. Her voice hadn't cracked, but her eyes were full of anger. Not grief, anger. I nodded once, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement. Then I kept walking. Outside, the air was damp with early spring. I stood for a moment on the church steps and looked up at the sky. There were clouds, but the rain hadn't started. I thought of Jack. I wondered if he had imagined this exact scene, Dana furious, me quiet, the will passed like a final confession. A car pulled up to the curb. My son stepped out. Joshua had insisted on not attending the funeral. I hadn't pushed him. I'd simply told him the date and place, and left it at that. He said he didn't want to watch strangers pretend to grieve for a man they didn't know. But he'd come to meet me afterward. He said he'd be waiting. He hugged me the moment he reached me. He was taller than Jack now. Thinner. Thoughtful, like I had been at his age, but steadier. He didn't ask questions. I handed him the envelope, the documents, everything. He glanced at them and raised his eyebrows. "Are you serious?" he asked. I nodded. "All of it. All of it." We sat in the car in silence for a few minutes. Then he said, "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel." "You don't have to feel anything," I said. "It's yours. That doesn't mean it defines you." He folded the will and placed it back in the envelope carefully, like it might break. That night, he slept in his childhood room. We didn't talk much. I made soup. We sat at the kitchen table like we used to when he came home from school, and I didn't bring up Jack unless he did. But I saw it in him, the processing, the recalculating. You spend your whole life thinking your father abandoned you, and then you find out he left you everything. That's not something you digest in one evening. By the end of the week, the news had broken. Dana must have leaked it herself. The headlines were more dramatic than the truth: tycoon leaves fortune to secret son, second wife cut out of will. There were segments on local news stations. A few national ones picked it up online. Reporters called our house. I didn't answer. They sent emails. I didn't respond. They camped outside Joshua's apartment in Seattle for 2 days until they got bored and moved on. Then the letters started coming. From Dana's lawyers at first, vague threats, challenges to the will, accusations of undue influence. They claimed Jack had not been in his right mind. That he had been manipulated. That I had somehow coerced him into rewriting everything behind her back. None of it held. Mr. Goldberg had expected this. He sent me a packet with everything Jack had prepared: notarized medical evaluations, video statements, signed declarations. Even dated recordings of conversations between Jack and Dana, the kinds of things no one expects to hear again. In one of them, Dana's voice was cold, dismissive. She told Jack she was tired of nursing a declining brand. In another, her children laughed about inheritance, made jokes about finally cashing out. Jack must have heard it all. And unlike the Jack I once knew, the one who avoided confrontation, this version had decided to act. Joshua and I met with Mr. Goldberg the following week in his office. The man was as professional as always, but there was a faint note of approval in his voice, as if even he had hoped Jack would set things right before the end. "Everything is protected," he said. Jack knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted this to hold. He slid a small flash drive across the table. "Keep that. It has everything you'll need if they escalate." They did. Dana filed a suit within 3 weeks. Her lawyers demanded mediation. We declined. She tried public pressure. Gave an interview where she cried on camera, claimed betrayal, said Jack had been isolated and sick. It didn't work. The documents were airtight. The judge refused her petition. One by one, every claim was dismissed. Her children tried another route. They sent Joshua long emails, first angry, then pleading. Said it wasn't fair. That he didn't even know Jack. That they had been raised as his kids, had lived with him, had built memories with him. But they weren't his blood, and Jack had never adopted them. The law was clear. Joshua read their messages but didn't reply. He asked me what I thought he should do. I told him it depended on what he wanted, not from them, but for himself. "Do you want them in your life?" I asked. He shook his head. "No. Not really. It's not about the money. I just wish it hadn't come to this." "So do I said. But Jack made the decision. Not you." Eventually, the noise quieted down. The media moved on. Dana's public appearances dwindled. A few organizations distanced themselves from her. One of her son's job offers was quietly withdrawn. No one said why, but we could guess. People talk. Through it all, I tried not to let any of it harden me. I gardened. I volunteered at the local library again. I helped Joshua find a financial advisor. We spent more time together than we had in years. Not because of the inheritance, but because it brought a strange kind of closure neither of us had realized we still needed. People started treating me differently too. Neighbors I'd known for years, who had never brought up my past, began to mention Jack. One of them, a woman I'd worked with decades ago, called and said, "I always wondered what happened between you two." I told her the truth, he outgrew the life we built. Or maybe he thought he did. She didn't argue. There was no celebration in any of this. No vindication. Just a gradual return to balance. I didn't gloat. I didn't post anything online. I didn't reach out to Dana or her children. I didn't need to. And Joshua, well, he handled it better than I ever could have imagined. He said no to a book offer. No to interviews. He took what was left and built something useful with it. But that part came later. In the weeks immediately following the funeral, what mattered most was the silence that replaced the years of uncertainty. Not everyone gets closure. I did. We did. And as odd as it may sound, I was grateful. 6 months passed. Summer came and went with little fanfare. The world kept moving, as it always does, even when something massive has shifted under your feet. The inheritance was finalized without further legal issues. Dana and her children went quiet after losing their final appeal. I don't know where they went. They disappeared from the news cycle as quickly as they'd entered it, replaced by fresher scandals, newer headlines. I occasionally caught Dana's name mentioned in passing on social media, always with some new speculation about her future, her finances, her silence. But I stopped reading the articles. None of it had anything to do with me anymore. Joshua took his time deciding what to do. He didn't move out of his apartment in Seattle. He didn't buy a new car. When the lawyers told him the final numbers, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It's more than I ever imagined. And more than I'll ever need." We spent several evenings talking about it, not about the money itself, but what it meant. He wasn't comfortable being rich. That much was clear. He'd worked too hard to build a life based on principle and purpose to let money change that. He taught history at a community college. He loved it. He didn't want to leave it behind. Eventually, he settled on a plan. He created a foundation. Nothing flashy. No gala dinners. No press releases. He named it after my father, a man he barely knew but had always respected because of the stories I told. The foundation gave scholarships to students pursuing public service careers. It funded local arts programs. It quietly paid off the student loans of teachers in underserved districts. When he told me about it, I didn't say anything at first. I just listened. Then I said, "He would have been proud of you." Joshua looked away, nodded slightly, and said, "I'm not doing it for him." "I know," I said. "That's what makes it right." The money didn't change Joshua. If anything, it clarified him. He became more himself, generous, thoughtful, but cautious. He didn't go looking for attention, and when it came to him, he redirected it. He kept teaching. He married a woman named Emily, kind, funny, quiet in the best way, and they had a daughter the following spring. She calls me Grandma G. I didn't ask for it. It just stuck. One morning, while I was tidying up the porch, I found a letter in the mailbox with no return address. The envelope was plain. The handwriting was elegant, looping, the kind you don't see much anymore. I opened it carefully. It was from Elise, Jack's older sister. We hadn't spoken in over 20 years. Not since the divorce. Back then, she'd written a short note, polite, cool, diplomatic. Something about boundaries, about wishing me well while choosing to support her brother's new life. I hadn't heard from her since. The new letter was different. She wrote that she'd followed the story in the news. That at first, she hadn't believed it, thought it was exaggerated or misrepresented. But then she saw the court records. The legal filings. And the truth began to sink in. "I never reached out after the divorce because I thought that was the right thing to do," she wrote. "But I want you to know, I never stopped thinking about you. Or about Joshua. I kept photos. I have one of him at age 4, holding a paper airplane on your back steps. He looked so proud. I remember that day." I had to stop reading for a moment. She went on to say that she hadn't been close with Jack in his final years. That he'd become increasingly private, harder to reach. She was surprised, and not surprised, by the will. She said, "It makes sense, in the end. He tried to set something right. And then, I hope you found peace. I always hoped you would." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and placed it in the back of my recipe book, tucked behind a page with a worn-out scone recipe I hadn't used in years. Later that afternoon, I pulled down an old photo album. Not to wallow, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself of what really happened. Of who I had been, and who we were, before it all changed. There were pictures of Jack and me when we were young, sitting on picnic blankets, laughing in the kitchen, posing with baby Joshua in our arms. None of them were perfect. But they were real. One photo caught my eye. We were standing in front of our first house, both of us holding mugs. It must have been a Sunday morning. Jack's shirt was wrinkled, and I looked half asleep, but we were smiling. Really smiling. That was the last version of him I remembered clearly. Before the ambition took over. Before everything else crowded out the quiet. A few days later, I went to visit his grave. I hadn't returned since the funeral. I wasn't avoiding it. I just hadn't needed to. But something about Elisa's letter made me feel like it was time. The cemetery was calm. Early fall. Trees just beginning to turn. The headstone was simple. His name. His dates. Nothing else. I stood there for a long time, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure I needed to say anything at all. Still, I spoke. "I don't hate you, Jack," I said. "I stopped hating you a long time ago. But I won't pretend you didn't hurt me. You did. You left, and you let us disappear. I gave Joshua a story to protect him, and you let me carry that weight alone." I paused. "But you remembered him. In the end. And maybe that's not enough, but it's something. I see the man he's become, and I see the better parts of you in him." I reached out and touched the edge of the stone. "Whatever peace you were looking for, I hope you found it." I left a single rose on the grass and walked away without turning back. That night, I slept better than I had in years. Not because everything had been resolved, life rarely works that neatly. But because I had finally stopped carrying someone else's silence. I had told the truth, at least to myself. And that was enough. 2 years have passed since Jack's funeral. Life now moves at a slower rhythm, and I've stopped resisting it. I live in a modest house near a lake in Vermont. The property isn't large, but it has enough room for a garden, a porch swing, and a narrow path that leads down to the water's edge. I spend most mornings in the garden, most afternoons reading on the porch, and most evenings watching the sky change colors over the lake. The silence I once found unbearable has become something I value. I used to think silence meant loneliness, now I think it means clarity. The kind of quiet that comes after a long, painful noise. You don't realize how loud your life has been until it stops echoing. I see Joshua often. He brings his family up every other month. The girls, there are 2 now, are bright and curious, and have already figured out how to run straight to the kitchen when they arrive, knowing I'll have cookies waiting. The older one, Lily, likes to help in the garden. The younger, Anna, is still in the everything goes in the mouth phase, but she's determined to catch up with her sister. Watching Joshua parent them is strange in the most wonderful way. He's patient. Gentle. He listens more than he talks. Sometimes I catch him saying something I once said to him, word for word. I don't point it out, I just tuck the moment away. The foundation he started has grown slowly, deliberately. He's resisted pressure to expand too quickly. He says the point isn't growth, it's impact. "I'd rather help 20 people deeply than 1,000 people superficially," he told me once. That sounds like something I might have said, though I never did. He and Emily are steady together. Their life isn't dramatic, and that's what makes it strong. No one's playing a role. They've built something ordinary and joyful, the kind of life Jack and I tried to have once, before ambition overtook affection. As for Dana, her name still appears now and then, in a minor column, a panel appearance, a local event. She's careful now. Calibrated. Her public image never quite recovered, but she found a quieter lane and settled into it. I don't follow her. I don't check. If her name crosses my screen, I scroll past it. There's nothing left for me there. About 6 months ago, I had a visitor. I was deadheading flowers in the front garden when a gray sedan pulled into the driveway. I didn't recognize it. A man stepped out, maybe late 60s, tall, with a slight limp. He introduced himself as Charles Langston, said he'd worked with Jack years ago on one of his economic initiatives. "I know this is a bit unexpected," he said, "but I was driving through the area and, well, I wanted to say something, if you'll let me." I offered him a seat on the porch and poured 2 glasses of iced tea. He didn't make small talk. He got to the point. I wasn't close with Jack near the end, he said. He kept most people at arm's length those last few years. But we had one conversation I've never forgotten. About your son. And about you. I sat still. It was maybe a year before he passed. We were in D.C. for a conference. He was drinking more than usual. Said something about wanting to rewrite things. Not the past, he knew that wasn't possible, but the ending. I didn't speak. I didn't trust myself to. He said, I don't know if I'm worthy of that boy. But I want him to know I remembered him. That I thought about him every single day. Charles paused. And then he said, I hope she knows I didn't forget. I just couldn't figure out how to come back without making it worse. I looked out toward the trees. That's all I came to say, he added gently. I thought you deserved to know. I thanked him. We didn't speak much after that. He left within the hour. After he drove away, I stayed on the porch until dusk. There was no new grief in what Charles had told me. But it shifted something. For a long time, I had assumed Jack's silence meant indifference. Cowardice, maybe. But maybe it had meant shame. Maybe his distance wasn't about forgetting, but about feeling unworthy of return. It didn't make everything right. But it made it more human. I wrote Joshua a letter that night. Not about Charles, not directly. But about Jack. I told him things I hadn't said before, small memories, early stories, things a son might want to know even if he never asked. I told him how Jack used to read aloud to my belly when I was pregnant. How he cried the first time he held him. How he once drove 2 hours to find a stuffed giraffe Joshua had lost, just to keep the bedtime routine intact. I didn't try to redeem Jack. I just gave Joshua the whole picture, not the perfect father, not the villain, just the man. When Joshua called me a week later, his voice was calm. Thanks for the letter, he said. Too much? I asked. No. Just enough. There was a pause, then, I didn't know he was that kind of man once. He was. For a while. I'm glad I know that now. I've stopped trying to control the narrative. That's what time teaches you, that the truth doesn't need defense, only room. The truth waits. It doesn't argue. It just stays there, steady, until you're ready to sit with it. Sometimes I walk down to the lake in the early evening with a thermos of tea. I watch the water and think about the quiet kind of legacies, the ones that aren't attached to headlines or foundations or financial portfolios. Legacies like kindness. Like children who grow into good men. Like knowing when to let go of anger, not because someone apologized, but because you no longer want to carry it. I used to think survival was the goal, getting through the hardest parts, making it to the other side. Now I think survival is just the beginning. Peace is what comes after, if you're lucky. And patient. And ready. I turned 62 this spring. It's a strange number, not round enough to feel like a milestone, not young enough to ignore. But it came with clarity I hadn't expected. My joints ache a little more now. I move slower in the mornings. But I've also noticed I feel less urgency to prove anything, to anyone. I used to think aging meant becoming irrelevant. Now I think it means becoming more selective, with your time, your energy, your stories. You stop offering explanations. Not because you're bitter, but because you finally understand what deserves your voice. That's probably why the letter caught me off guard. It arrived on a Tuesday, in a soft blue envelope, handwritten, no return address. I opened it with mild curiosity, expecting maybe a thank you from the library fundraiser I'd helped with the week before. Instead, the letter began. You don't know me, but I believe you knew my father. My name is Chloe. I sat down before reading the rest. Chloe was Dana's daughter. Jack's stepdaughter, though of course, he'd never legally claimed her. She must be in her early 30s now. I'd never met her in person. I'd seen her in photos once, years ago, on the back of a magazine. She wrote carefully. Her tone wasn't confrontational, but not overly apologetic either. It read like someone trying very hard to say something honest, and not quite knowing how to. I know this must feel strange. My mother is ill. She doesn't speak about my father much anymore, but we all grew up knowing about you. You were, not exactly forbidden, but definitely unspoken. I'm writing because I never got to know the man who raised me in the way I thought I did. I'm not asking for anything. Not money. Not closure. Just, a picture. A real one. She asked what Jack had been like, before the public image. Before Dana. Before he became the man who took polished photos and made careful statements. She wrote that her brother, Mason, didn't want to reach out, he was still angry. But Chloe said she didn't want to live the rest of her life pretending curiosity was disloyalty. I folded the letter and left it on the table. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit there for 3 days. I watered my tomatoes. I walked by the lake. I read 3 chapters of a novel I wasn't enjoying. But the letter stayed in my mind. I wasn't sure what she was really asking. Did she want to be comforted? To be told that Jack had loved them, despite the will, despite the recordings, despite what he'd left behind? Or did she truly want the truth? In the end, I responded the only way I knew how, honestly. My reply wasn't long, but it was deliberate. Chloe. I appreciate the tone of your letter. And I want to be clear, I hold no bitterness toward you. You were a child in a situation you didn't create. Your father, Jack, was once a different man than the one the world saw later. When I met him, he was earnest. Curious. He made bad coffee and good conversation. He loved learning. He was unsure of himself, but he had a steady kind of hope that made people believe in him. We built a life together that felt real, small, ordinary, but deeply ours. And then it ended. I won't tell you all the details. You likely know enough. But I will say this, Jack didn't leave because he stopped loving. He left because he didn't know how to stay when he wanted something bigger than home could offer him. That doesn't make it right. But it's the truth. I don't know what kind of father he was to you. I imagine, like many men, he tried, and failed in small ways, and maybe succeeded in others. Toward the end of his life, he tried to do something that resembled making peace. Whether it was enough, I'll leave for others to decide. I hope this helps you understand him. I'm not here to rewrite your memories. Only to share the ones I know. Take care of your mother. Take care of yourself. G. I mailed it 2 days later and didn't expect a reply. None came. I don't know if she was comforted or disappointed. I didn't write the letter to give her either of those things. I wrote it because I understood what it meant to want answers and be strong enough to ask. I mentioned the letter to Joshua during our weekly phone call. He listened quietly and then said, I don't think I would have answered. I know, I said. And I don't think you needed to. He paused. But I get why you did. That was all he said. That was all I needed. What I've learned, especially in these later years, is that peace rarely comes in one large moment. It arrives in fragments, small, scattered recognitions that the past no longer holds the same power over you. A few weeks ago, I opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I hadn't gone through it in years. Inside were the usual things you keep and never look at, old cards, faded photos, notes that once meant something specific and now just feel like echoes. I found the hospital bracelet from Joshua's birth. My handwriting on the birth certificate request form. A letter Jack had written me during one of his early business trips, apologizing for being away so long. He said he missed the way I smelled like vanilla and rain. I had forgotten he ever said that. There was also a picture, one of the few of the three of us together. Jack was holding Joshua, barely a year old. I was standing beside them, hair a mess, laughing at something. The photo was slightly blurred. No one was posing. It was real. I held it for a long time. It didn't hurt to look at anymore. It just existed. And I realized that was the shift I had been waiting for without knowing it. The day when the past stops demanding to be healed or corrected, and instead becomes something you can hold without flinching. That's not to say I've forgotten. I haven't. But memory doesn't have to mean pain. It can mean witness. It can mean acknowledgement. I placed the photo in a new frame and set it on the shelf in the living room. Not as a monument. Not as a warning. Just as part of the whole picture. I turned 65 last week. Joshua joked that I should consider retirement. I told him I already had, years ago, from drama, from noise, from all the things that never gave back what they took. These days, my world is smaller, and that suits me. I wake early, make tea, take my time. I go to the local library on Wednesdays, where I still help shelve books. I volunteer at the food pantry on weekends. I watch the girls whenever Joshua and Emily need a night out, though most nights they'd rather stay in. Lily is 11 now, full of opinions and questions she doesn't quite trust adults to answer. Anna is 7 and recently discovered chapter books. She reads to me like it's her job. The days stretch gently, and I fill them without rushing. That's the rhythm I've earned. One morning in late April, I received an invitation in the mail, from Joshua's foundation. They were hosting a public event at the Cultural Center in Seattle. A dedication. To honor the person whose legacy gave us the means to begin. There was no name listed on the card, but I knew exactly who he meant. I called Joshua that night. "You're dedicating a wing in his name?" I asked, not critically, just cautiously. He hesitated. "Not the wing. Just a corner. The reading room." It felt right. I didn't argue. But I wasn't sure how I felt about it. Jack had never seen the center. He hadn't built it, hadn't taught a class in it, hadn't stood in the quiet morning light coming through its windows. That had been Joshua's work. His and Emily's. Their teams. Their students. But I understood what he was doing. Not rewriting, reframing. He wasn't all bad, Joshua said after a pause. I've stopped needing him to be. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, I'll be there. The event was modest. Maybe 70 people, most from the community, some old friends and donors, a few former colleagues of Jack's, ones I hadn't seen since the early years, when our names were still spoken in the same breath. I sat near the back. I wasn't looking to be recognized. I wasn't there to be part of the story. I just wanted to witness what my son was choosing to say, and not say. The reading room was bright, open, lined with shelves of books. There was a small bronze plaque mounted beside the main window. It read, "The Jack Reed Reading Room. For the next generation of quiet thinkers, hard questions, and full truths." No dates. No biography. No fanfare. Joshua stood in front of the room and spoke without notes. His voice was steady, measured, the way it always is when he's talking about things that matter. My father and I didn't share many years together. He wasn't part of my childhood. I knew him more through silence than presence. But I know this, he gave me life, and in the end, he gave me a means to do something meaningful with it. He looked out across the room. I don't stand here pretending our story was perfect. Or clean. But I do believe that truth matters. That remembering someone fully, for what they were and what they weren't, is more powerful than pretending. He smiled faintly. This room is dedicated not just to a man, but to the space we all need to think clearly, read deeply, and understand each other better. No applause followed. Just a long, thoughtful quiet. Afterward, a few people approached me. Some remembered me from long ago, from campus events, fundraisers, photos on dusty shelves. A man I barely recalled, who once ran a policy committee Jack chaired, told me he always wondered what had happened to me after the divorce. "You just vanished," he said. I smiled. Not vanished. Just quiet. Another woman, who introduced herself as a student of Jack's from his earliest teaching days, said, "I always admired how you held your head high. Even when the rest of us were watching from the sidelines." It was strange to hear. For so long I thought no one had noticed me at all. But they had. Quietly. From a distance. And maybe that's enough. When the event ended, I stayed behind a few minutes. Everyone had filtered out into the main hall. I stood in the reading room alone, letting the weight of it all settle. I ran my fingers gently along the edge of a bookshelf. This wasn't mine. Not my name, not my room, not my work. But my fingerprints were here in their own way, in the way Joshua had learned to build things, to listen, to hold contradictions with grace. I had not built a foundation or funded a wing. But I had raised the man who did. And that mattered. As I walked back to my hotel, I thought about how often we look for healing in noise, in declarations, in confrontations, in final words shouted into a void. But most of the healing I've known came in quiet ways. In unmailed letters. In long walks. In unread journals. In telling the truth to no one but yourself, and realizing that's enough. I no longer feel like someone who was erased. I feel like someone who survived long enough to tell the story, and, more importantly, to live past it. That night, before bed, I opened the book I'd brought with me. It was the same copy of Persuasion I read once during the worst year of my life. Some pages were still marked, sentences underlined in pencil. One line I had circled, long ago, stood out again. "You pierce my soul. I am half agony, half hope." Back then, it was the agony I understood. Now, it was the hope. The next morning, I returned home. Vermont was cooler, calmer. The trees were starting to change, not quite red, not quite gold. Just the beginning of something. I took my tea to the porch and sat with a blanket around my shoulders. Lily had left a drawing in my coat pocket, a crayon version of the reading room plaque, misspelled and smudged, but bright with color. I pinned it to the fridge. Then I opened the cedar chest again, not out of grief, but simply to look. And for the first time, I didn't think of what was lost. I thought of what I had passed forward. What I had chosen not to explain, but to live. And how sometimes, that's all the legacy we ever really need.